Thank you very much, Mr. Bao, for accepting this interview. The book is very interesting. It's a very interesting and informative read. It made my preparation for the assignment somewhat pleasurable, so thank you on that note, too.
Kind of you. Thank you.
Yep. Now, in the book, you, on numerous occasions, you talked about how structurally different the economy of India and the economy of China are as of now. And how or what do you think those structural differences forebode for the future trajectory of the economic growth for both of these countries?
In a curious sort of sense, both the countries have to do what the other country has done. In India, the investment amount has to be increased as a percentage of the GDP. Although India still is investing quite a bit, India saves close to 35-36% of its GDP. But clearly India has to step up on the investment rate. And China, which invests nearly 50% of its GDP, has to clearly get some of the investment structurally down and consumption pushed up, while India consumes quite a lot of its GDP. So interestingly, the economic models of both the countries are sort of mirror images of each other, and each has to now do what the other has done. Of course, India cannot and should not push consumption down to the level that it got pushed down in China, and therefore should not be pushing investment up to the limit that it got pushed up in China. So to that extent, there is a moderating factor on both sides. But yes, to put it simply, China needs to consume more, India needs to invest more.
And the Chinese leadership seems to realize that, and it has taken numerous measures within the last 2 years since the 2008 crash and the subsequent slowdown to try to boost the consumption in the Chinese economy, particularly in the rural areas. How successful do you think those efforts have been, and what else need to be done?
But you know, it's very interesting what's happening in China. The rate of consumption is growing very fast. So if you look at it in absolute terms, as a sort of standalone component of the economy, it's growing at almost, 17 to 18% per annum. So that's a huge growth rate. But even more interestingly, as a percentage of GDP is not growing very fast. In fact,
the GDP has been growing so much faster.
That's because China has been investing so much. Therefore, investment as a component of GDP is growing. GDP is growing very fast. Consumption on a standalone basis is growing, but not as a share of GDP. So now what that is doing is leading to a bit of an imbalance in the economy, where some of the investment could result in overcapacity, could result in bad assets because of the sheer structural makeup of the GDP. So I think that's interesting for China. What China needs to do to get consumption growing even faster so that it becomes a larger component of the GDP is it's not only simply growing by itself, but it's also growing as a component of the GDP. And I think the Chinese government knows and has been talking about it, but quite a few of the fundamental reforms are taking a bit longer than was being expected. The hukao system, which allows people to move freely, does not allow people to move freely, and you would like that to be changed so that people can move freely with their families from the rural areas to the urban areas. So that will give a boost to urbanization in China, and therefore give a boost to consumption. Now, the Chinese government has been talking about doing away with the hukao system, but has not yet done. For instance, also the sort of user charges are today biased in favor of manufacturing. Interest rates are far too low in China. Some of the other inputs are priced such that manufacturing has an advantage over services. So China will have to change that, so that the services industries, which are more consumption focused, also grow faster. Also the fact that the state will have to come in and create a social safety net for ordinary Chinese, so that they have the confidence that the sort of $4 trillion of household money that is available in China with banks is actually brought out and put into consumption rather than into savings. So I think the Chinese government knows what it has to do, but the pace of change is not as good, I think, as the world would have liked it to be. And finally, the revaluation of the yuan. If the yuan was to appreciate against the dollar, then clearly that would give a boost to consumption in China.
That's a hot button issue here, as I'm sure you're aware. And speaking about on this side of the Pacific, recently, particularly within the last year or so, there are many U.S. business leaders who have been voicing their concerns about the open door policy that has been in place in China for the last, a good bit of last 30 years, through the means, chiefly the means of low cost of labor, low cost of capital, and low cost of land and lower taxes, which have been huge incentives for foreign investors. And that open attitude, that open door policy, there are signs that are showing that it may be slowly swinging shut. And do Indian business leaders share that sort of observation or concern? And if so, on top of that, do you guys in India look at this as maybe a possible opportunity for more investors to come that way, your way?
To stay with China for a while, I think these structural imbalances in China would need to be addressed. So I don't think there should be too much concern amongst overseas business people if China was to go down this route, revalue the yuan, let wages increase, let interest rates increase. This would clearly give a boost to domestic consumption and domestic services business and take the buyers away from manufacturing. And therefore, what the Western businessman will lose in terms of investment opportunity in China will gain because of a higher consumption base in China. So perhaps it's not that much of a concern and possibly something that should be welcome. As far as India is concerned, India has always had a little bit more restrictive foreign investment policy than China has had. And clearly this is now a moment for India to relax some of those restrictions that it has placed on foreign investment and be far more welcoming of foreign investment, particularly in manufacturing, particularly in infrastructure areas, so that the absorptive capacity of the Indian economy needs to go up. I mean, India has a very nice consumption base. India has a very nice services base in the economy. But India clearly needs to have a much larger manufacturing base. And to do that, it needs to have much better infrastructure, much more investment in areas like power, ports, roads, railways, to get the consumption, to get the absorptive capacity of the economy going up. So that's a challenge for India. If some of the investment dollars which were earlier earmarked for China now need to find other places to go because China is focusing towards increasing domestic consumption, then India could be a natural recipient of those dollars. But for that to happen, India A has to change its policies, make them far more welcoming, and B, increase the absorptive capacity of its own economy.
Do you think democracy is a prerequisite for long-term sustainable economic growth?
One is tempted to say yes, isn't it? Because if you look at the world, most of the wealth of the world flourishes in a democracy. China has been perhaps the singular exception that has sustained for so long. Earlier, the Soviet Union was one, but it did not sustain beyond the point. China today has given enough evidence of the fact that it can manage high growth rates, although it is not a democracy. The question is, where do we go from here? Because imbalances and pressures are going to build up. If we look at world history over a period of time, perhaps China will have to democratize its society much more than it has done. Now, whether China's democratic model will be entirely similar to the Western democratic model is something that is open to question, because the Chinese state is quite clear that that is not the case, that they have their own innate culture and they have their own innate history, and therefore they could make do with quote-unquote lesser or different facet of a democracy than the West has. I think the jury is out on that.